Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. And today I'm joined by Janet Gregory, who will be answering the question, do we need testers on agile teams? I'm sure this is something that you have asked yourself from time to time, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Janet has to say on the matter. And if you'd like to ask Janet any questions about her presentation, you can type your questions there into the questions field on the control panel, and you can do so at any point during the course of this webinar. And then at the very end, we'll go through your questions one by one. So let me now hand over to today's presenter, Janet Gregory. Hello, Janet.
Hello.
Janet's just
Can you
getting her
see my
screen
screen
open.
all right?
Yes, indeed we can.
Perfect. So, I'll take it away. I hope everybody is doing really well today. I think most of the folks that are online right now are probably in Europe, so it's afternoon. I live in Canada, so it is 7 o'clock in the morning for me. So if I search for words the odd time or anything like that, please bear with me because it's pretty early in the morning. So one of the reason that I'm doing this talk is I get asked this question, and a lot of times when I'm teaching a course or at a conference, I get these two sides. And so I decided to put my voice out there, so here we are today, right? I hear one side saying, you know, team members should be able to do everything. We don't need testers. Testers should be writing code. The other side says, no, testing is a skill. Programmers can't test. They don't have the right mindset. And it goes on and on and on. And of course, like anything, there's probably not one side. If we think about it as a scale, we have to talk about what this means. And I think a lot of people aren't really taking that into consideration, right? So when I talk about testing on an agile team specifically, because that's usually where I talk about testing, it's not a separate methodology. Agile testing is not a separate methodology. Testing is an activity that anyone on a team can do. There's different types of testing, and I think that's what we really have to talk about. Testing begins at the very beginning, as soon as we first start talking about an idea. In a traditional waterfall kind of project, testing is usually at the end, right? You have all of the coding and then testing becomes at the end. Some teams manage to kind of sprinkle it throughout, but a lot of teams do not. In an agile team, to have potentially shippable product at the end of every iteration or sprint, whatever you call it, or at the end of every story, if you're doing Kanban, you need to be testing as you go. And the focus should be on preventing defects kind of idea. And this is a slide I have been showing since I first started talking about Agile, right? We talk about blurred lines between roles. And that, you know, the functional teams, the programmer, tester, BAs used to be functional teams, and now we're combining them, and there's an overlap. Been talking about this for a very long time. In fact, Lisa Crispin and I have written 2 books based on this premise that the whole team is responsible for testing. But I think this is where people get very, very confused, and it's got turned around. So people and coaches, and there's books that talk about it now, that kind of advertise that everyone can do everything. And I'm not sure that's quite right. I kind of like this Venn diagram that shows there's some overlap, but there's still separate skills that need to be taken into consideration. So are there real lines between? right? And I think this is what people need to ask themselves. What can we do? Who actually can do what? Now, if we do blur those lines, I ask myself, can I do everything? I started off as a programmer. I've got programming skills. They're pretty rusty. Um, I could code test code, like test automation code, but I don't think I could do coding production code. At least I could not do it very well. And I have a background in that. So we need to start thinking about that. This particular graph, or chart, whatever you want to call it, is from Matt Barcombe. He wrote a sidebar for us on this idea in More Agile Testing, the second book. The idea is that the basic, this is where people start. If you are a new programmer, if you are a new tester, you're starting to learn. You learn some of the skills, right? You can do the work, but you're learning and you grow. The advanced, this is where you get to be specialized, right? It might take years to be really good at what you do. And that's where we think about if you are a good tester, whatever that means to you, you're in the advanced. The idea of meta and heuristics is that you can apply the heuristics. If you're an expert, you can sense what heuristics to when, what to apply and when. So heuristics being a rule of thumb. If I'm looking at a screen and I'm trying to test it, I'll go, oh, you know, I can sense that this is the thing I should be using. Generalists can be taught the basics, right? They can be taught how to look for specific signals to be able to apply those heuristics. So if I'm a specialist, right, I can teach somebody, so let's take a real specific thing. So if I'm a programmer, and I'm a really good programmer, I can teach a tester basics in programming skills. I can teach them what to look for and maybe some of the risks and different things. I can teach them. I can teach them what kind of signals to look for. If we reverse that, if I'm a tester, I can teach programmers the basic in testing. I can teach them some basic ideas and thinking about things. So the idea of a generalized specialist is being able to share things, but we have a lot of skills in one thing, right? We can teach skills to others. Now, the question, does it make sense to expect people to be expert in more than one thing? Sure, I think it does. However, do you have the time to do that? If it takes years to be advanced in a skill, does your team, do you have the time to be able to be expert in everything or in at least two things? We can gain those extra skills, right? But it doesn't come immediately. It does not come immediately. So the idea of a generalized specialist, I think, is what appeals to me the most. What do we choose to specialize in? Now, if we talk about testing, right, this, the idea of the thinking tester comes from Elizabeth Hendrickson's keynote, The Thinking Tester Evolved. It was a very good keynote, and she talks about different characteristics that a thinking tester has, right? My favorite characteristic and what I kind of tell people to look for is curiosity. She calls it relentlessly curious. Because I think if a tester is curious, they will learn anything, right? So there's a lot of characteristics that we look for in testers, but they don't talk about the skills that come into it, right? So T-shaped skills. David Guest in 1991 first kind of defined these. And so it's not an agile thing. It's just a good way to think about how we develop our skills. The horizontal bar represents the broad skills. Maybe that's the generalized parts, right? The ability to collaborate across disciplines with experts in other areas, how to apply that knowledge in areas of expertise other than one's own. So that kind of comes down to, if we think about that previous chart, the basics or the applying some of the heuristics. That vertical bar is the depth of related skills. Your expertise in a single field. So it makes a difference when we start thinking about what skills do we want to develop. What is our strength? What is our expertise? And you can be expert in more than one thing. But it tends to be things you're passionate about, things that you want to learn about. So I took a shot at trying to define what characteristics I'd like to see in a programmer, because programmers on agile teams are not those typical throw it under the wall, pizza slide it under the door. They're collaborative, right? They have to be analytical, detailed, logical thinking. I remember when I took my programming or my comp sci, the logic, I had to take logic courses to learn how to code. And so I think that's really important. But they're also investigators and collaborators, clean coders, I would hope, right? So you want to think about what's important, right? So an analogy I use to talk about the difference between what programmers are looking at and what I would call testers looking at is my husband and I travel a lot. So I get to see a whole lot of the world. When we're in Europe and driving around Europe, my husband usually drives, especially if we're in a country that is driving on, the wrong side of the road, the left side versus the right side. But what he does is we have a GPS, we put it up on the windshield. He uses that GPS to kind of look and say, where do I have to turn? Do I have to turn left? Do I have to turn right? Which lane do I have to be in? As he's driving, he also has to be aware of all the things around him, where cars are, what the signals are doing. Are they turning red? Going around traffic circles, roundabouts, whatever you call them. He's aware of his immediate surroundings. And I think that's where programmers are. They're in the code, they're looking, they're thinking logically, they're trying to figure out what their code does. Myself, I'm the code driver, the navigator, not even navigating so much, I'm a code driver, I get to kind of put in my 2 cents. But I'm looking at it from a different perspective. I don't watch the cars around me. I'm not necessarily looking at the light switching or where we have to turn immediately. I have a big map on my lap. I need to see the big picture. I kind of look at that and think, okay, if we've got programmers and testers, it's switching contexts. When we say, hey, programmer, you're down in your code now, we expect you to test your own code in the context of the whole system. So the programmer would literally have to stop, pull over to the side of the road, stop, refocus on the big map and say, okay, where's our system? What does it do? How's it trying to do it? And start looking at it from a different perspective, and they're context switching. So when you have both skills and perspectives, we can share, we can collaborate and work with each other. And I think that that is the key, to have different perspectives, right? Even when we're testing our own code, as if a programmer's testing his own code, we have a cognitive bias, right? I was very fortunate when I was coding. When I first started coding, my very first supervisor said to me, he'd come in every morning and he'd say, we didn't have testers, by the way. He'd say, Janet, how are you going to test today? And he would make me walk through my thought process. What are we going to test? At the end of the day, he would come back and he'd say, Janet, what have you tested? And those two questions really make you think about it. So can programmers test their own code? I think so, but I think you need somebody else asking you questions and questioning your own biases. And that's kind of what it is, right? We all can learn new things, but we need help as well. Now, if we've got programmers and testers and we have thinking testers, right? Not zombie testers that are following scripts, but thinking testers. And we have collaborative programmers. When we look at our team as a whole, right, look at it to see, do we have the knowledge on our team or do we have to learn it? And maybe that's where some of the generalization comes in, right? Maybe we have to build up more domain knowledge. Maybe we need to pick up more database expertise. Where do we have to do? Maybe what we're working on needs more security testing, but we don't have it. Where do we learn it? So Rob Lambert and Adam Knight have talked about these kind of square-shaped teams and building up the teams. So maybe the depth of skills is something we do have to work at, but maybe we look at it from a team perspective as well. Can I help build those skills? Right? Testing is a team problem, right? It is. We use tests to give feedback, but if programmers are not thinking about testing, they often don't even think about building testability into their code. I said clean coding, part of that, right? That's part of building testability in. We want to be thinking from different perspectives. So I have this picture of gazelles and wildebeests and zebras because they're three animals that if you ever go on an African safari, they work together. One has good hearing, one has good eyesight, one has good smell. They watch and listen and watch for predators, right? They use their strengths, and I think that's what teams and agile teams specifically really need to think about. Now this is all kind of mushy, kind of soft test talking. So if we start looking at some of the real practices, right? So I'm going to talk about the agile testing quadrants, and I do know that not everybody likes them, but they are useful. It is a model that can be useful in some ways. So if we think about quadrant 1, which is technology-facing tests that guide development. These are the programmer tests. These are low-level tests that the programmers do as part of their code. They automate them. If they're doing test-driven development, they're guiding their development with those tests. Programmers can test, but we can help them. Testers can help them, not necessarily by writing the unit tests, but by being test consultants, right? I can help and say, hey, have you thought about this? What about this boundary condition? Different ways. Quadrant 2 is business-facing tests that guide development. Every time we write a test before we start coding, we're guiding development. We're helping, right? When we ask our product owners for examples, we're thinking about how do we test first, right? Even if we have a programmer write a simulation or a prototype, whether it's paper or in code, we're testing first. Quadrant 3 is business-facing tests that critique the product. So we have lots of different people involved in this. It's not only testers, right? Exploratory testing, probably testers, but I know some really good programmers that can do some good exploratory testing. They do it on their code when they're coding, right? When we're doing usability testing or UAT or any of those things, those are critiquing the product, but we might be bringing business users in to help us. Testing is an activity that happens throughout. The fourth quadrant, which is technology-facing tests that critique the product, these are all the other kinds of tests, you know, performance, load, security. The quality attributes we talk as reliability, browser compatibility, portability. There's a long, long list of other quality attributes we need to think about. These are all testing activities, and you want to think about, do we have these on our team? So one of the things that the quadrants do for us is I like to use them as a thinking tool, just to talk about testing. What kinds of testing do we have to have on our teams so that we have that common language? So when we talk about a test, everybody on the team understands what it is. One of the other things I really like about the quadrants and about this model is that it emphasizes the whole team responsibility. Testing is not a specific activity for testers. Programmers have a bunch of things they can do that they are responsible for. But there's a whole other kind of testing activity that maybe we need testers for, or that will help. Every team will be different. Now, so Elizabeth Hendrickson, as you can tell, I like to quote her a lot. She had an article a while ago, Two Sides of Software Testing, and in her book, Explore It, she talks about this as well, right? She talks about testing as checking plus exploring, right? Checking, does the system do what it's supposed to do? Yeah, let's automate that stuff so that it can do that, and we don't have to think about it. The exploring, looking for things we didn't think about, right? We want to be understanding and taking a good look at the system, going, what didn't we think about? And this is one of the places that testers really can excel. I do think, though, that Elizabeth forgot something. I think that she forgot another place to explore and didn't call it out specifically. I know she knows that because I've talked to her about it. But sometimes we get stuck in the idea that exploring is about exploring the software, about exploring the product. And if we think about it in a different way, exploring ideas, right? It's not always about the code. So testing early is testing ideas, testing assumptions. When we ask questions, when we ask for examples, what we're trying to do is get a shared understanding of the story, right? Questioning is an art. And good testers have learned to do that very well, because what we're trying to do is prevent rework. Rework is waste. So can we prevent defects in the code by asking questions early? And that's where testing as an activity happens throughout. Let's start that. Programmers think implementation. Testers have a different perspective. Let's combine those both. So I think testers can add a whole lot of value when we start to think about a feature, perhaps an epic if you're doing Scrum. We have a feature. We divide it up into stories, and this can be where testers add a huge amount of value. Their skepticism, their critical thinking skills, their curiosity to think of different scenarios. these can be used to slice the story into testable chunks, right? It can help us get a better understanding of the big picture. Testers can also work with the product owner, the team, to articulate high-level acceptance tests using examples which turn into tests, right? So when you're having the conversation on each story, let's think about those acceptance tests. There are product owners out there that can define the acceptance tests on their own. I know they exist. People tell me. I have never personally had the privilege of working with one. So testers can help in that way and add a lot of value, right? The story, those high-level acceptance tests, that conversation, using the whole team with their different perspectives is really important. And this happens before coding, right? And then we have, you know, the magic that happens, the coding, the testing, the automating to get that story completed. We're fixing defects, and ideally at the end of this, the product owner says, yeah, it meets what my intent was, I like it, I accept it. Fast feedback throughout. But a lot of times we forget about where the testers can fit into all of this. And so when we think about it, a tester needs that curiosity, right? To be able to add value in testing early, in being able to add value by helping automate. I'm not even talking about automation for this whole thing, this whole talk, right? But being able to explore the product well. Testers need to be thinking. Collaboration isn't about delivering, sorry about that. Collaboration is about delivering and receiving feedback. It's about being able to listen. It's about being able to articulate, express opinions, delivering constructive feedback, which really helps teams understand what they're trying to build. These are the important skills and characteristics that a tester has to have. I think the next webinar that the EuroSTAR guys are sponsoring, that the Huddle is sponsoring, is by Alex. I'm not even going to say her last name, but she will be talking about how to build a testing community and how to develop some of these skills. So she's going to be doing that, so I'm not going to go there. But can a tester be thinking about what applies in my context, right? The idea of technical awareness is really important. So do I have to know how to code as a tester? It helps, right? But I definitely need that technical awareness, the basic coding skills so that I can collaborate with the programmer. I need to be able to talk to him or her so that when they start saying, hey, we need these parameters, and we start talking about automation, I have some idea about what they're talking about. Technical awareness. What basic skills do you have to be able to collaborate, right? We can't sit in that bubble anymore and not have them. In other contexts, maybe my technical awareness is not necessarily big on the coding and understanding that, but maybe it's working on a data warehouse and I really need to be able to understand databases inside and out and how to transform and all of those kinds of things. What is your needs, right? So watch and really think about what that is. From a programming perspective, we need to be thinking about, how do we test this? How am I going to test this? How are we going to test this? Am I building it from a testability perspective? It really is about a mindset shift, and not only for testers, right? So This, if we stop thinking about a tester is there to find bugs or ensure that the requirements are met or breaking the software, and thinking about what can I do as a tester to help deliver a quality solution, right? And it's not even about software anymore, it's about solutions. It's about products, right? This attitude can make a huge difference in our collaboration on a team. This attitude is new to many testers. It's not necessarily new to non-agile testers. I know some testers who are still working on traditional teams that understand this attitude, right? Um, I think that the software attitude is common to the finger pointers, right? Hey, you broke this, fix it, right? And I think that's what gives testers a bad name. I think we get less hostility if we don't treat programmers as the opposing team. We're on the same team, right? Testers are not the quality police. Their role is not to say it is ready or not ready. That's what sets us up for opposition, right? It sets the stage for conflict. If our role as a tester is to provide information about the state of the system so that a decision can be made with the right information, much better, right? It's not setting it up for conflict. We need to be thinking about those agile principles and values and asking, what else can I do? It might be as simple as asking questions early to expose hidden assumptions, right? It's a mindset shift for programmers. Instead of, coding and throwing it over the wall and then fixing the bugs, if they start thinking about how do I create testable code and deliver the software successfully or deliver the product, they're more worried about the software because that's what they're coding. They don't necessarily think about the bigger picture. How does this fit into the whole solution? Should they? Yeah, they should. But again, it's that they're looking at the code. I have worked with really good programmers that test their own code, but again, it comes with a cognitive bias that prevents them from seeing all the risks. So teams work well when they work together. I also think it's a mindset switch for the product managers, the product owners, whatever your team calls them. They have a big part in testing as well. One of the things that make a successful team is having product owners that look at this, that look at helping the team. And I see I have a bug in this slide because I say software and it shouldn't. It should say product or solution, because the product owners, product managers should be looking at that solution, right? How do we know when we're done? How can I help the team making sure we build the right thing? So it's the team working together. Now, and I'm kind of winding down on my last slides here. The question was, at the very beginning, do we need testers on agile teams, right? I want to tell you a quote from one of the programmers I worked with, and this is quite a few years ago, 2001, 2002, one of my first agile teams, right? He wrote a paper, and this is a quote taken out of that paper. Better results will be achieved when testers are made a core part of the team. They can aid customers in defining and automating acceptance tests, as well as play the role of analyst and flesh out hidden requirements and assumptions. He went on for quite a bit longer, but programmers recognized, this is a programmer, recognized back in 2001, 2002, the testers add value, right? He did go on to say traditional testers, not so much, but thinking testers, right? And we're still arguing over it today. That's 15 years later, 16 years later, and I don't understand it, right? So I firmly believe, yes, testers add value. Their role might change depending on the context, and there are exceptions, right? But I do believe testers can add value on agile teams, and there is a place for them. I'm going to just kind of introduce this Cynefin model. Some of you may have seen it, some of you maybe not, but the idea is there's these pieces, and I can't call it a quadrant because there's a fifth one in the middle. Obvious. These are it's a model to kind of talk about different types of projects that we might be working on, different types of products, right? So obvious is there's not many risks. We've done this before. It's been done 100 times before. Perhaps doing communication protocols, right? It's just changing it over and over again. Complicated is we have known problems. It's perhaps we have, it's very large, lots of communication, lots of business rules, maybe we have third-party vendors, maybe the system's just large, it's a large business systems, right? Complex. This is when we're working on something new, brand new. We have no idea how to solve this problem. There's a lot of risks, right? And then chaos is there's no real process. I've worked on these teams. It's not someplace I want to live. And then disorder is when you're moving from one kind of place to another. You're changing. So I won't talk about that so much. Now, the obvious. We've done it 100 times before. This might be an area where maybe we don't need testers, right? But in my experience, most product development is not done in this space. The complicated, these large systems, right? It's not new. We've done these things before. But I think testers here add real value. They can see this big picture, and it's usually a big picture, right? They're coming from the customer perspective. This piece is where we can use behavioral driven development, acceptance test driven development, specification by example, to define the tests early to help guide development, right? This is where we can really look at those quadrant 2 tests. We can really add a lot of value there. The complex, this is the high risk. I think testers can add real value in this kind of product development as well. Testers can use their thinking skills to consider different scenarios, different risks, right? Adding those what if questions, performing exploratory testing early, giving feedback, right? Testing those assumptions, thinking. And the chaos, little process, right? This is where you're testing after, usually, because there's no real process, or it's a waterfall process. And so my own bias comes into place, because I have personally never worked on a waterfall project that was not chaotic. And so and I know they exist that are not, but this is where exploratory testing on the system as a whole works really well, trying to figure it out. So there's lots of different places, and maybe the only place where testers don't add a tremendous amount of value is in this one obvious quadrant area, right? So we want to be thinking about where do testers fit? I believe they add value, or they can add value. I have seen some teams where they're not, but testers aren't responsible for quality, right? That whole team is. We can help programmers because they don't code alone. They have to understand what to code, and by asking questions early, we can help that, right? So what new skills do you need to learn to be effective, to add value? We really want to be thinking about and remembering that it's that whole team. Testers that believe you can test quality in probably don't work well on agile teams. You need to be thinking about building it in from the very beginning. We can't, I should clarify that. Test quality in meaning testing the software at the end. I need to change that sentence. But we want to be able to think about questioning early and collaborating and really understanding that the team is committed to quality. Testing is an activity that happens throughout, but where can we help? What can we do to add value to get that quality built in? And so that's kind of the end of my slide deck. I've got the resources I kind of mentioned as Elizabeth Hendrickson's keynote, her book Explore It. There's some other resources on here. There's some more learning I talked about. Adam Knight, Liz Keogh talks a lot about the Cynefin framework as well. So there's lots of places to go and read and look. I like getting email. Please send me an email. It's janet@agiletester.ca or tweets. Pretty easy again, Janet Gregory CA. And now I'm going to turn it back to see if there's any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Janet, for that presentation. And as Janet mentioned there now, it's time to have a look at some of your questions. But just before we do, I just want to run through one or two slides. So Janet, as she mentioned there, she has a number of books out, and really fantastic books. And earlier this year, she did an ebook with Janet Gregory for us, with Lisa Crispin for us. And you can access this ebook here, following that link. It's also in the document that I've shared with you, the useful links document. We have some more webinars taking place this week. We have the webinar that Janet mentioned there with Alexandra Stedebek, and this will be looking, so that's how you pronounce it, I believe.
Thank you.
I could be wrong, and apologize to you, Alexandra, if I am pronouncing it incorrectly. And she'll be looking at growing a company test community, roles and paths for testers. So that's at 2 p.m. tomorrow. And we have another webinar lined up for next month with Daniel Billing, and his name is spelled in there wrong as well. I need another tester here to help me out, but it's Daniel Billing, not Billin, and he will be talking to you about enabling a security testing mindset, a guide for leaders, coaches, and managers, and that'll take place in December. And if you're not already aware, we are heading to Copenhagen next year for the EuroSTAR Conference 2017, which will be chaired by Iris Dingster O'Riordan. And we're delighted to announce that our call for submissions is now open. So if you'd like to find out a little bit more about how to submit, just head over to the EuroSTAR website. We also have another conference taking place in early 2017 called UKSTAR. It's a 2-day testing conference with 25 plus amazing speakers, and you can find out all about that on that link, UKSTAR. And right now, until this coming Friday, you can get 2 tickets for the price of 1 if you purchase a ticket for UKSTAR. All right, so let's have a look at some of your questions here. I have a question that asks, in an agile team, is there a need for test managers?
Good question. So test managers aren't usually part of a delivery team, where test managers tend to live and what their role has changed is they can become a conduit or a practice leader. A lot of, especially large organizations that have individual testers on individual teams, there needs to be some continuity, a community of practice. There's different words for it, but a community of practice. How do we share ideas? How do we make sure our testers learn and grow? And so that test manager role becomes more of a support role and being able to share, because they're not usually in a day-to-day operations. Sometimes they can help if you, for example, if you're in a large organization and you have multiple teams working on one product, sometimes those test managers can help share information between teams and make sure that that happens, right? But they're generally not in the day-to-day operations, so they're not knowing what's going on in every single team. Hopefully that answers your question in a very short. I think Alex is going to be talking a little bit more about that tomorrow. Is it tomorrow that she's doing this?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I think she'll be talking a little bit more about this tomorrow as well.
Another question I have here for you, Janet, says, can you give us some practical advice on how to help someone change their attitude from we are here to find bugs to we are here to help deliver better software?
Yeah, and that's one of the hardest things to do, I have to be honest, is if they've got that attitude as I am here to break the software, I think the only way I have seen it work really successfully is to show the value add by being early, by asking questions early. Sometimes leading by example is often the best way. It's a tough sell sometimes for people to think about that. People want to know what's in it for me, right? Programmers do, testers do, everybody. Why should I change, right? And so a lot of times by showing them the value, by saying, look, if I'm here and helping ask these questions and preventing defects, then I'm not spending a whole lot of my time doing rework, retesting, finding silly defects that should not have ever been found. I've been helping teach testing to the programmers so that they're actually giving me better code, right? And I think leading by example has worked best for me. Baseball bats don't, or cricket bats, or whatever you're using. That they don't work. Stick does not.
Another attendee here asks, can having remote testers work successfully on agile teams?
Yeah, yes, the short answer is yes. However, and I will classify what I mean by that, is if organizations, so if I have a remote tester and they're on the same time zone or out by 1 or 2 hours, it means that we can utilize or use the technology that exists these days. So if I want to pair with a programmer or if I need to give feedback to the programmer, we can get on a Skype call, we can share screens, we can have that fast feedback. I can chat on my IM. If you're on different time zones completely, so you're 8 hours out, all of a sudden that fast feedback, which we depend on agile teams, goes away. So can you be remote? Yes. Is it the best way? Not necessarily, but I have seen some really successful teams. So Lisa Crispin, my co-author, she was a remote tester for a year. She ended up leaving because she didn't like it, didn't like the remoteness. She needed people around her at least some of the time. But one of the things that they did, and there was a 2-hour time zone difference, was they created a virtual Lisa. So they had a laptop with really good speakers and a really good webcam, and they put her on a little rolling table so that they rolled her kind of virtually around for every stand-up, for every iteration planning meeting, for whatever they needed. They would roll Lisa around so that they could see her. She was part of the team. And when you make that effort to make those remote team members part of your team, it can work.
I have another
Okay.
question here. It's kind of an interesting question here. It asks, or it basically says that you were talking about a tester's mindset, which should be to help product quality and not to break software. Do you have any advice on how to uncover personal mindset on interview?
Well, it's easy to tell curiosity by just listening to the interviewee. Do they ask any questions whatsoever, right? Are they expressing any kind of curiosity? The mindset, when you ask them questions, listen to the words that they use. For example, I did a telephone interview once with my product manager, and we were interviewing for a tester for an agile team. And within the first 3 minutes, he said, this person said, "I am really good at breaking the software." Within the first 3 minutes. So I literally kind of made a chopping kind of I was going to say noise, but I just kind of went to the other fellow I was interviewing with and said, no go. If somebody has that attitude and uses those words consistently, how good are they going to be at collaborating with that programmer when they take such pride in breaking the software? Now, or breaking the illusions of the software, right? If it is part of a tester's job to be able to explore and say, hey, here's some risks, right? It is part of their job, but it is not the main job. It is part of giving feedback. And so listen to the words they use when you ask open-ended questions. That will tell you a lot about their mindsets, right? And how they approached certain problems or how they would approach, right? Or very specific experiences. And sometimes, you know, you get an interviewee that has read really well and they can say all the right words and you really don't know till they come in. But usually you can tell by the words they use.
Another attendee is asking, can a tester be a Scrum Master?
Sure, there's no reason why not. The only thing I would say is watch your team dynamics. Who is the bottleneck right now? If the tester is not a bottleneck, and because the programmers are doing such an awesome job, then yes, there's no reason why they can't be a Scrum Master. However, if the tester is still really, really busy trying to juggle a whole lot of things, it makes no sense to put that person as a Scrum Master because now you're asking them to do even more. So watch your team dynamics before you do that. But yeah, they make some really good Scrum Masters.
Another interesting question here. And this person is asking, do you have any suggestions for helping testers who have great exploratory skills but are shy and tend not to speak up in story kickoffs, etc.?
Yeah. So learn how to speak. So I don't particularly like public speaking, and I started off not being able to public speak because for lots of different reasons. I attended Toastmasters for like 11 years. I think this last year is the first year I didn't join just because I've been traveling so much. But find some way to learn how to use your voice. I worked with an introvert manager, QA manager, and one of the things I coached him on, because he would sit in meetings and never say anything, and he'd walk out of the meeting, and then the next day he'd say, hey, and he'd start listing all of his issues. He needed time to think. So one of the things I coached him on was start being prepared before you go into a meeting, right? Make sure you know what we're going to talk about, be prepared, have your questions ready because you have some great ideas. And it goes the same for anybody else. Be prepared will help immensely. If it's just because you're shy and don't have confidence speaking, then really think about how you can get that confidence, because you're not giving half of your value, and that's hurting the team if you don't speak up.
I think, Janet, anyone who's attended any of your tutorials would find it hard to believe that you have had issues with public speaking at all. Seems to be no
Oh,
problem
trust
to
me.
you.
I did. I had lots and lots of trouble, actually, yes. But I learned. I'm a firm believer that anybody can learn anything they put their mind to it.
Right, well, we'll take one more question before we wrap up. This last question here asks, what's the role of agile, what's the role an agile test can play in retrospectives? It's interesting. There's an
Yeah.
add-on to this here, especially improving process to build a quality product.
Yeah. So I think that, and this comes back down to, if we don't start being able to express opinions in meetings or in retrospectives, right? Testing is a team problem. So if we're having issues with the product quality, find some way to bring it up in your retrospectives and say, this is an issue. How are we as a team going to solve it, right? And part of it might be gathering data, right? Why do I think this? So it's sometimes not good enough to say, hey, I feel that our product quality is bad. Try to figure out why you have that feeling, being able to articulate it and back it up with data, right? We've had 20 bugs escape to production. Our quality has gone down because the last release we only had 10, right? Back it up with data. Really, really helps. Showing trending. But it is a team issue that has to be solved. It is not a tester's problem. It is a team's problem.
I have
Okay.
just one other person has jumped in there, Janet, just while you're on the topic of
Yeah,
agile process, if you don't mind taking one last question.
sure.
This person here is asking, can a test engineer be a project owner or is it a test manager role?
So can a tester be a product owner? Is that the question? I personally think that product owners, the domain experts, need to come from the business. Testers might know the product really well, but they're not necessarily the best people to say this is where the product should go, right? So I think that product owners, the product managers, whatever you call that, has to have a really good understanding of where the product is going or needs to go. And testers aren't necessarily the right person for that. If I think, so I'm thinking out loud here, by the way, because that's an interesting question for me. I think that if the tester is trying to do both, lead the product, he will put or she will put their own biases into, and it will reflect in their testing and may actually deter from good testing. But I think it needs to be a business person that leads that product development. Where is it going? if that makes sense. It's an
Oh,
interesting question.
okay. We'll leave it at that, Janet, or you'll never get any peace. But we would like to thank everyone for coming along this morning and all your questions. And we'd especially like to thank Janet Gregory for taking time. I know it's early for you over in the States, and we appreciate you
Canada.
coming in.
I'm from
Sorry,
Canada.
sorry, sorry, Canada. Sorry, I've made that mistake before. I've said the States to Janet. So my apologies. It's Lisa who's over in the States.
Yes,
Yes, yes.
yes.
My fault there.
No
So
worries.
early start over in Canada. And we would like to thank you for taking the time out for this presentation. We mentioned a lot of other links there, such as the ebook download and the EuroSTAR, the call for submissions, and you'll find the links to all of these in the attached useful links document there. And in that document too, you will find a link to where this webinar recording will be available. And I can see a lot of people are asking, will this webinar be recorded? And yes, we do record all of our webinars, so you can check it out again at a later date. So that's it from us here today. Thank you all very much and take care.
Thank you.